This presentation deals with the topic of psychotherapy. There is a bewildering array of different types of psychotherapy, and I'm going to do my best to try to sort them into categories for you. The first category are what are known as insight therapies. These are called insight therapies because the person doesn't get better until they get some insight into the cause of their problems. Now, the different insight therapies disagree as to what the source of the problems are and what exactly it is the person is trying to get insight into, but they share the common assumption that it's all about self-discovery. The person needs to figure something out before he or she can get better. The most famous of these, of course, is psychoanalysis, which we've talked about in some detail in the previous module when we talked about Freud. Psychoanalysis is based on Freudian psychology, with the assumption being that much of what is going on with an individual is deep in the unconscious and therefore something the individual cannot be aware of. So the object of psychoanalysis is to help the client gain insight into the way that their past events in their life and their unconscious processes are causing anxieties for them right now. The techniques of this therapy will vary depending on the therapist, but they may analyze dreams, they may engage in free association, they may use hypnosis, but there are a variety of techniques for getting to people to explore what's going on in the unconscious. Many of you have probably seen bad movies where Freudian therapists work with a client for some period of time, and it almost always ends with the person rolling around on the floor in a fetal position, expressing intense levels of emotion. This is something known as catharsis, the purging of the emotion, and it's one of the goals of psychoanalysis. It's a way of helping the person get rid of that anxiety. Another extremely popular form of insight therapy is the person-centered therapy based upon the ideas of the humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers. According to Carl Rogers, the reason people are unhappy and are experiencing stress in their life is because of a gap between the ideal self that they feel like they should be and the real self that they perceive that they are. And often this ideal self has been created through what they perceive to be the expectations and demands of other people. And they're very sensitive about not having been able to live up to those expectations that others have of them. One of the important components of the person-centered therapy that Rogers employed was to treat their clients with what he called unconditional positive regard. You accept the person as he or she is. You don't make any criticisms of them. You don't make any judgments about their worth as a person, but you help them explore the space between the real self and the ideal self and get them to understand that they perhaps are unhappy because they're trying to live up to unrealistic standards that other people have set for them. So again, it's an insight therapy in that the person does not get better until they come to this realization. Existential therapists try to get the person to realize that one of the reasons they're kind of adrift and not doing well is because they have not taken charge of their life. They have not created meaning for themselves. They have been too passive. They have allowed things to happen to them rather than making things happen for themselves. Existential therapists can be very confrontational. Whenever a person tries to pass the buck or portray themselves as a victim or say that powerful other people are the cause of their trouble, the therapist will step in and say, no, look, you're the one in charge. You have to take control of your life. You have to create meaning. You have to create goals. But again, it's an insight therapy because the person does not improve until they come to this realization. Gestalt therapy is similar to insight therapies in a number of ways, but it's just different enough that I put it into a different category. Gestalt therapists try to make people more aware of themselves so they can move towards self-actualization, but there is not this profound insight necessarily that they need to acquire. Gestalt therapists play a lot of psychodrama games where people role play talk to empty chairs, and so on. It's kind of an interesting therapy, but not one of the mainstream therapies that you're most likely to see. Behavior therapies apply the principles of conditioning and learning to the treatment of mental disorders. The behavior therapist believes that a lot of psychological problems are due to people just having learned unfortunate patterns of behavior. And so by applying proper operant conditioning techniques or classical conditioning techniques, they can modify behavior in a way that makes the person feel better. For the behavior therapist, there's no concern about insights or what's going on in the unconscious. For the behavior therapist, the problem is the behavior. And if you eradicate the behavior, you don't need to worry about the underlying cause. Behavior therapy appears to be especially good for treating phobias. In your textbook, you'll read about a process known as systematic desensitization, where in a series of baby steps, a person who has a phobia about something can overcome it by becoming more and more comfortable in very small doses with the thing that they're afraid of. Aversion therapy is a form of behavior therapy where people begin to pair things they're trying to not do with unpleasant consequences. So a person who's trying to eat less or to stop smoking or to stop engaging in some other bad habit may undergo aversion therapy to eradicate the undesirable problem. Implosive therapy is kind of the opposite of systematic desensitization. In implosive therapy, you try to get the person to vividly and vicariously imagine the worst possible experience they could have. And in flooding, they may actually put the person in a situation where they'll experience this. For example, a person with a fear of snakes or a snake phobia may have a snake drop right in their lap, and they're forced to sit there while the snake writhes around. And when it's all over, they realize the worst thing they can imagine has happened, and they got through it. And this is not the first step that you would take in therapy, but if systematic desensitization hasn't been working and the person agrees to it, this is a way you may want to go. Behavior modification is a form of behavior change where you systematically alter reinforcement schedules to encourage more desirable patterns of behavior. It's often used in children because it's easier to control reinforcement patterns for kids than it is for adult clients. A lot of therapists have been experimenting with virtual reality technologies to treat things like phobias through systematic desensitization. So that's kind of an exciting new area where this is going. Cognitive therapists focus on unrealistic and illogical belief systems as the source of an individual's problem. The goal is to sort of restructure their cognitions and to teach them more productive and satisfying ways of thinking. Cognitive therapists can be very directive. They will confront people, they will argue with people, they will try to show people how unrealistic and illogical their beliefs are. Often, cognitive therapists combine what they do with behavior therapies. So cognitive behavior therapy is a thing where you're using some components of cognitive therapy, some components of behavior therapy. Some of the most popular cognitive behavior therapies are the rational emotive therapy technique, RET, Beck's cognitive therapy for depression. On this slide, you'll see a number of different types of therapy that are underlined and highlighted in blue. If you click on these links, you'll be able to go to videos that show you simulations of these different therapies. There are also links to these kinds of therapy on the module webpage. Some other flavors of therapy would include what's called somatic therapy or biological therapy. This is where there's a direct physical intervention. You're doing some surgery on a part of the brain. The split brain procedures we talked about earlier in the term would qualify. Electroconvulsive shock therapy would also be a form of somatic therapy. Whenever you're using drug therapy, psychopharmacology, to try to help somebody with their mental disorders, that too is a form of somatic or biological therapy. Group therapy doesn't really apply to the term doesn't refer to a specific style of therapy, but whatever therapy is going on takes place in a group setting rather than with individuals alone. There are many different benefits to that. Seeing that you're not the only person with these problems can be helpful. Having group support as a way of, firming up your commitment to following through on the things you should be doing can be helpful. But one of the big advantages of group therapy is simply that it's usually less expensive because you're dividing the costs of the therapist's time among many different people rather than paying it all yourself. The million-dollar question, of course, is, does psychotherapy work? And there have been a lot of critics over time that propose that it really is not very helpful, probably not worth the time and effort. They would say that the man in this photograph is crying because he just got his bill from the therapist. And so the question of whether psychotherapy works or how well it works is very controversial. And it is a difficult question to resolve, right? Because how do you actually do studies on this? You can't randomly assign people to therapy conditions. That would be probably unethical. And when you're getting data from people, if you ask the individual who's been in therapy for a while and paying money for it, is it helping you? Of course, they're going to say yes. If you ask the therapist who's been collecting money and spending time and devoted their whole career to this, whether it's doing anything, they're of course going to say yes. And so it's been difficult to get a handle on this. The best tool that we have is meta-analysis, where you analyze the results of a large number of studies over time. And meta-analysis does indicate that the average person in therapy does get better more frequently than the person who does not seek therapy. In fact, the average person in therapy shows more improvement than 80% of people who do not seek therapy. So another way to think about this is about 20% of the people in the population will do just as well not seeking therapy as going through therapy. But 80% of the people will do better in therapy than they will without therapy. If you're interested in a career as a therapist, there are a lot of different routes you can take to get there, and the day-to-day work that you do will be pretty similar. But there are differences in the different occupations, and from the outside it's a little confusing to see these different kinds of therapists and understand exactly how they're different. Let me march down this list. Psychiatrists have a medical degree, so they've gone to med school and they've got an MD, and they have then specialized in the treatment of mental disorders. This makes them different than a clinical psychologist who has a degree in psychology, an advanced degree, usually a doctorate. And the clinical psychologist is specifically trained to deal with psychological disorders from the get-go. Psychiatrists, because they have MDs, generally make higher salaries than clinical psychologists. And in most states, they can prescribe medication that clinical psychologists cannot prescribe. Counseling psychologists are very much like clinical psychologists to the extent that there's a difference between their training. Clinical psychologists are trained more to deal with severely disturbed people suffering from things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Counseling psychologists more often specialize in helping so-called normal people through difficult times. So they deal with people suffering from grief or trying to get over a divorce or dealing with some sort of addiction. Having said that, there are lots of clinical psychologists who do the kinds of things counseling psychologists do, and lots of counseling psychologists who work with very disturbed people. So it's hard just to look at what the person's doing and figure out what kind of psychologist they are. But for psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and counseling psychologists, you're probably talking about getting a doctorate degree, an MD, a PhD, or what's called a PsyD. So you're talking about a fair number of years of schooling after college. There are other ways, though, of becoming a therapist that don't require quite as much time. The most popular route for a lot of our students is becoming what's called a licensed clinical social worker. It's a 2-year degree, and you go to a school of social work, but you specialize in dealing with clients in a therapeutic session. You may be dealing with families, you may be a marriage counselor, you may be specializing in work with children. So you're still getting to do therapy, and the healthcare system is actually set up to be very favorable for licensed clinical social workers. So if you'd like to get into the therapy business pretty quickly and follow a route that's well traveled, you might think about a licensed clinical social work degree rather than a doctorate. If you're religious and are interested in incorporating religion into your practice, there's something called pastoral counseling. A lot of individuals actually seek help from their rabbi or their priest or their pastor, and these individuals often don't have professional counseling training. There are degrees in pastoral counseling that enable individuals in these types of spiritual careers to also be effective counselors. And if this sounds like a combination that's right for you, this could be a good road to travel. And finally, there are all kinds of very specific forms of therapy. Jungian therapy, psychoanalysts who are trained in Freudian techniques. They get certificates rather than degrees, and they have intensive training at institutes devoted to that specific form of therapy. So they're not really psychologists per se, but they are therapists who employ a certain technique. So if you are interested in the field of counseling, therapy, clinical work, there are a lot of different ways that you can get there. And feel free to come and speak to me or any psychology professor about how one goes about exploring careers in this area.